I'm enormously pleased to be here and to participate here on this occasion at which we think together about the vital legacy of Edward Said. And I would like in particular to thank Rosi Bredotti and the Center for the Humanities. This is, as we all know, an institution of extraordinary caliber that has become one of the key centers for thinking about the humanities in public life for our time. So thank you, Rosie. In general, academic talks labor under the pressure to produce something new, but the issue I want to think about is one that has been around for several decades, if not a century, and it would be easier for me if the question of binationalism had been discussed thoroughly and everyone already knew its history and its impasses. But my sense is that this older idea has yet to be heard. In short, what do we mean by binationalism in the context of Israel-Palestine? Are there one-state and two-state versions of binationalism? Or is binationalism something that can be thought in a certain tension with the very idea of the nation state? I offer you these questions not because I can or will answer them in the time I have to speak today, but only to make a more minor suggestion. First, namely that traditions of binational thought have been occluded by the changing history of the meaning of Zionism, even though binationalism was part of an important strain of Zionist thinking throughout a good part of the 20th century. And secondly, to suggest as well, following Saeed, that there can be no conceptualization of a workable binationalism within the terms of settler colonialism. So I work in two directions at the same time. Indeed, I have found that being able to work in two directions at the same time, perhaps contrapuntally, is obligatory as one tries to think about the very form of relationality designated by binationalism. To follow diverging and converging paths is not the same as vacillation, ambivalence, or contradiction, but rather an effort to move beyond and against the unilinearity of thought in order to pursue a certain complexity and what appears most promising about its dynamics. So in the first instance, I propose to talk about a version of binational thought within Jewish intellectual life, one that was actually part of Zionism for several decades and which has disappeared from the semantic reach of political Zionism as we know it now. In the second instance, I want to give some indication of why that historical notion of binationalism developed within Zionist thought, why it proved to be inadequate. In short, even its best versions, in my view, did not adequately call into question the implication of Zionism within settler colonialism, a term to which we will return if we have time. Finally, I want to suggest that some aspects of that tradition of binationalism nevertheless bear similarities to the late binational vision of Edward Said, or at least that these views can speak to one another. Said clearly understood this resonance between his own view of binationalism and the one formulated within early Zionist debates, but he also underscored the point of necessary divergence between them. Asked in an interview in 1999 whether his vision of inclusion and the one-state solution actually resonates with one of the old streams of Zionism, Said responded, yes, he had read the early traditions, including the early documents of Brit Shalom, and the moves toward federated authority proposed by Ihud, the political party vanquished when Ben-Gurion came to power in 1948. Saeed continues, there were people of a fairly important caliber, such as Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, who was the first president of Hebrew University, Hannah Arendt, and a few others who are not so well known. These are the international luminaries who realized that there was going to be a clash if the aggressive settlement policies and the unreflecting ignoring of the Arabs pressed ahead. End quote. And yet Saeed then makes clear that much of this discussion of binationalism within Zionism was part of an intra-Jewish debate taking place within the Zionist or Jewish camp. He continues, there were attempts to reach Palestinians, but the situation was overall so polarized, and the British were playing such a Machiavellian role in 1948, and the leadership of the Zionist community were also such clever politicians, that these individuals, who in the end were individuals, really didn't have much of a chance. He goes on to say, it was a rather restricted debate. I don't think one should overemphasize it, end quote. And yet, in 1999, in his essay Truth and Reconciliation, Saeed returns to this same formulation, this time, interestingly, with a greater sense of hope. Let me cite his remarks to you here. Quote, during the interwar period, a small but important group of Jewish thinkers, Judah Magnus, Buber, Arendt, and others, argued and agitated for a binational state. The logic of Zionism naturally overwhelmed their efforts, but the idea is alive today, here and there, among Jewish and Arab individuals frustrated with the evident insufficiencies and depredations of the present. The essence of that vision is coexistence and sharing in ways that require an innovative, daring, and theoretical willingness to get beyond the arid stalemate of assertion and rejection. Once the initial acknowledgement of the other as an equal is made, I believe the way forward becomes not only possible, but attractive, end quote. This second quotation does not fully vitiate the first, but it does open up the question of how to think about associated terms like coexistence, cooperation, cohabitation, and even binationalism. Reasons to be wary abound. And so I proceed with some hesitation, for I think there may still be some good reasons to return to this version of binational thought, if only to show how a more just version might be formulated. I'll mark in advance a certain kind of circularity that takes place here that, in my view, cannot be avoided. It goes like this. One might say that the acknowledgement of the other as equal precedes the radical structural changes at the level of the state that are necessary for substantial forms of cohabitation for binationalism itself. Or one might say that only once those structural changes, including the end to settler colonialism and the establishment of a constitution that protects equally the rights of all inhabitants, once those have been made, only then will acknowledgement of equality become possible. I'll return to this toward the end of my remarks when I consider the difference between different models of coexistence, some that assume continuing colonization and others that assume its end. But what is most important at this juncture is Saeed's insistence that the Jewish tradition includes an experience not only of diaspora, but a vision of binationalism that is crucial to the project of political equality. At various points in his career of political writing, Saeed makes a significant distinction between what he calls a self-segregating trend in Jewish life and a diasporic one. As early as 1968, in the Palestinian experience, Saeed marks the triumph of the former tendency within Zionism, one that he writes overrode its own moderates in establishing a form of nationalist segregation that refuses any counterclaim to territory or political rights of self-determination, end quote. He will later argue in his book, Freud and the Non-European, published in 2003, that the diasporic condition of both people, however historically distinct, forms the condition for acknowledgement between them. As early as 1968, he writes, the main characteristics of the Arab Palestinians' life since 1948 have been peripherality, isolation, and silence. All of those are conditions of displacement and loss. And then, within parentheses, he writes, it cannot fail to escape the Palestinians' notice, by the way, how much their experience begins to resemble that of the diasporic Jew. End quote. Later, in Freud and the Non-European, he will recapitulate this thought in another way, emphasizing, and I quote, the unhoused and diasporic character of Jewish life that aligns it in our vast age of population transfers with refugees, exiles, expatriates, and immigrants. He makes clear that this diasporic character of Jewish life is in tension with the self-segregating tradition. In some of his work on binationalism, he refers to Israel and Palestine as two peoples irrevocably bound together. And in that context, he suggests as well, Israel and Palestine are parts rather than antagonists of each other's history and underlying reality. Saeed knows very well these are distinctly different histories of displacement, and there's no absolute structural analogy to be drawn between them. And yet he holds out for a diasporic understanding, not as an aim or a goal of politics, but as a critical perspective on forms of political nationalism, and in the case of Zionism, on a form of settler colonialism that is bound up with the historical and ongoing dispossession of Palestinians from their homes. So Saeed is not naive about the possibilities of cohabitation or coexistence. His formulation suggests that only when he calls processes of identity enforcement are challenged and heightened forms of nationalism reverse course, that another understanding can emerge, one that draws upon and elaborates a diasporic sensibility drawn from different histories. There are, as we know, many skeptical questions that attend any suggestion of this kind. First, the forced expulsion of Palestinians in 1948 is not precisely the same as the expulsion of the Jews from Europe under fascism, and the analogy is made all the more complicated by the fact that it was the Zionists, often those who had been expelled or needed to flee, who then expelled the Palestinians. For Saeed, then, to ask Zionists to embrace the diasporic character of their own history and ethical sensibility is to ask them precisely to acknowledge the history in which their own policies forced another people out of their homes and off their homeland into an unchosen diasporic condition. We should not underestimate how very difficult it is to narrate and to show the history of the Nakba, as we saw last week when right-wing Zionists violently interrupted the efforts of Zochrot to commemorate the Nakba in Tel Aviv in what has become, indeed, and as part of a new legal assault on commemorating the Nakba in Israeli public space. My sense is that Saeed, in this writing, knows this difficulty quite well and is seeking recourse to the diasporic trend in Jewish cultural self-understanding precisely to heighten and to generalize a commitment to the rights of refugees. It's only consistent for a people to affirm their own rights to be alleviated of statelessness, their rights to sanctuary under conditions of persecution, by recognizing the general and transposable character of such rights. And even if the historical conditions of displacement differ, and even if one people or its emerging and continuing state apparatus is responsible for the displacement of another, reparation begins precisely through a recognition of the general and transposable character of the rights of the stateless to the political conditions of belonging, whether that is considered as a right to citizenship within an existing state, a right to form a new state as part of political self-determination, or another exercise of the right of political self-determination that may or may not take state formation as its telos. Of course, to be against nationalism is a good thing, especially in Europe right now. But if a people are deprived of the fundamental conditions for national belonging, does nationalism have a different valence in that context? A national liberation struggle is not the same as the nationalism of a nation state that continues to exercise colonial control over a population deprived of full rights of political self-determination. Even though the nationalism of a militarized and occupying nation state is not the same as the nationalism of a people developing a unified resistance to the condition of damaged rights inside the current borders of Israel, occupation and expulsion. But under certain conditions, every form of nationalism can convert into that heightened and destructive form, to be sure. Is binationalism the linking of two nations and thus two nationalisms? Or does the ethos of binationalism operate as a check on heightened nationalism? Is it the presumption of two equal nations, or is it a critical relation to the nation state and its forms of nationalism that is implied by the binationalism I seek to speak about today? Can one perhaps borrow, oddly, from queer theory, emphasizing the bi of binationalism, or the hyphen that sometimes enters between the bi and the national? All right, I know, wrong crowd. Even the proposal of a relative autonomy of both nations within a single state or administrative structure that establishes equality presumes that the one is next to the other, that the very boundaries established between the two are already part of the definition of each one. There's no autonomous space without a border, and there is no border there is no border without the constant elaborated negotiation of the border, and that means precisely there is no autonomy without a negotiated relation to the other, and that the relation essentially conditions the very notion of autonomy. Even separation is a way of having a very long-lasting relationship with whoever is on the outside of that wall. Of course, this is a kind of Hegelian turn, and it doesn't quite capture the complexity of the situation. In his early political writing, Saeed made clear it would not be possible for all Israeli Jews and Palestinians to enter into cooperative arrangements under conditions in which colonization continues to be the unaddressed condition of that form of cooperation. The point is an important one, since it brings us to the broader question of the conditions of a livable cohabitation, cooperation, a non-wretched form of binationalism. In the Palestinian experience, Saeed referred to a condition that could not be born easily, namely, and I quote again, to believe in a democratic, progressive, multi-confessional, multi-denominational Palestine, and yet to be forced to live cooperatively under Israeli domination. Cooperatively here is in quotation marks. Here, Saeed refers to the numerous cooperative associations that were set up after 48 to establish cultural goodwill with Palestinians who had remained within the borders of 48. Shortly thereafter, in the early 50s, came the Israeli land redistribution laws, the time in which Palestinians were given no rights to vote, had their mobility restricted, their access to employment, and were forcibly and legally separated from their land, much of their land. Indeed, they were separated as well from family and kinship members who had been pressured and forced to leave. In any case, Saeed here posed the question, what does it mean to enter into cooperative ventures under conditions of continuing dispossession, political disenfranchisement, and colonization? If cooperation presumes continuing colonization or takes place within it, if it retrenches forms of structural inequality, then the subjugated who cooperate ratify the status quo of their own subjugation. Of course, the apparent alternative to such cooperation, in quotation marks, would be resistance to the status quo of subjugation, dispossession, and occupation. Solidarity within a resistance struggle is thus different from cooperation that presumes and reproduces the terms of subjugation itself. How do we understand Saeed's formulation of coexistence within this second framework, resistance and solidarity? It seems clear that whatever is meant by both coexistence and binationalism in Saeed's writings from the late 90s and early 2000s is something other than this form of cooperation he placed within quotation marks in 1969, something other than accepting the status of the good colonial subject, something other than affirming dispossession and disenfranchisement with some measure of cheerful fatalism. Of course, there are now cooperative enterprises, mainly within the State of Israel, that continue to believe that the small incremental steps taken by communities of Palestinian Israelis and Jews will be part of the organic development of larger forms of living together, whether understood as part of a one-state or two-state solution, or, as some anarchists make clear, as part of a non-state-centered form of ethical sociability. But even within contemporary Israel, I believe that we can only find 2 or 3 schools that are committed to bilingual education, Hebrew-Arabic. If anything, the pressure has been increased on Palestinian Israelis to work and live in Hebrew, to learn English, to allow Arabic to be private, and certainly never a national language. This is, I would suggest, part of the broader cultural meaning of the loyalty oath that Palestinian Israelis are now obligated to perform, one in which they pledge their loyalty to a state conceived as Jewish and democratic, one that contorts, if not eviscerates, their very existence. The idea of small communities developing binational sensibilities in an organic way was always considered by Martin Buber and others as a way to further cultural understanding, understood itself as a precondition for a political form of cohabitation, in Buber's case, a federated authority. He was one of those Zionists in the 20s through the 50s who argued for agrarian cooperatives that would engage Jews and Palestinians in working the land and developing forms of coexistence. And yet for Buber, it was the European Jew who was the more fully developed than the Palestinian and who was supposed to accelerate the Palestinian entry into modernity. Indeed, the settler project was for him a civilizing project, one that presumed a developmental cultural difference between Zionists, conceived as Ashkenazi, and Palestinians, conceived as backward. Moreover, the idea of labor that was at the center of such imagined ventures was one that belonged to a colonial understanding of property. The settler, and let us remember that settlement has been the model of immigration and land appropriation since 1948 and before. The settler mixes his labor with the land and derives rights of property in a kind of Lockean scene. In 1929, Buber wrote an essay entitled National Home and Policy in Palestine, in which he delineates one major reason why, in his view, the Jewish nation has a right to return to its country, a form of land acquisition that he insists will always be a perpetual good for all humankind. He writes then that prior to Zionist settlement, the country was a wasteland, something we heard, of course, from Herzl many years before when he referred to Palestine as a land without a people, therefore thereby effacing the existence of the Palestinian people on that land. And Buber, in a similar gesture, claims now, 1929, it is settled country achieved through years of labor, the right deriving from creation and fertilization, what he called Recht der Produktivität, the right of productivity, is in fact the right of settlers, end quote. Hardly a stone's throw away from Herzl at this moment, Buber confirms the right of the settler colonizer whose work on the land produces an overriding right to the land. Indeed, in this context, he even uses the term kolonisatorisches Recht, a colonizing right. It doesn't matter that prior contracts or rights of ownership are nullified in the process, or that prior forms of working the land by Palestinians attentive to the needs of olive groves and lemon trees have been undermined or overridden by such processes. So we can begin to see an alarming paradox at the heart of some of the traditional models of cooperation. This does not mean that all efforts at cohabitation are doomed. It only means that we are perhaps under some obligation to understand the reasons why those forms of cooperation could only exist in scare quotes. Indeed, it's something of a risk to couple Saeed with Buber, since those two families briefly crossed. Buber lived at 10 Brenner Street in Jerusalem, owned by Bulo Saeed, who was Edward Saeed's sister's husband, his father's cousin. And the Saeed family reclaimed that dwelling when they returned from Egypt in 1942. Buber then moved to Talbiya in 42, and though I don't know the details, I think there was a little struggle about whether really Buber was under the obligation to move out of the Saeed home, but luckily he did. Okay, we won't go into those details. Most people know the name of Buber in relation to his ethics of I and thou, or at least the book by that name. His was an ethics that claims that one human should treat another not as an object, but as someone who can be addressed directly, and with whom a form of communication considered spiritual might take place. If Kant thought people should be treated not as a means to an end, but as an end, as ends in themselves, Buber recast that particular ethics in terms of the scene of address. A person should be someone who is addressed, that is, who is considered to be addressable, one to whom I can and would direct my speech, one who is in some sense acknowledged by that very address as someone who deserves to be addressed. Buber wrote a rather remarkable essay, Zionism and Zionism, in scare quotes again, in May of 1948, 2 weeks after Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel and became its head of state. Scare quotes. In this essay, he's distinguishing himself from Ben-Gurion and the political Zionists of the time. In a manner reminiscent of Saeed, Buber writes, and here I quote, "From the beginning, modern Zionism contained two basic tendencies which were opposed to each other in the most thoroughgoing way, an internal contradiction that reaches to the depths of human existence." He explains, and I quote again, "One can comprehend the two tendencies at the origin as two different interpretations of the concept of national rebirth. The first tendency," he tells us, "understands rebirth as requiring the return to and restoration of what is called the true Israel. This would involve a return from exile for the Jewish people. Accordingly, rebirth would be understood as the renewal and unification of the people as they build their common life with one another. This building or formation," sorry, need for water. This building or formation process is likened to building a home, but also to giving birth, though these remain for the most part metaphors in his text. According to the first tendency, the point is not simply to secure the existence of the nation, but to pursue what he called fulfillment, understood as spiritual reawakening or renewal. Now, the second tendency is the one that Buber clearly opposes, and it's that second tendency that grasps rebirth as a normalization. It holds that Jewish spiritual renewal requires a land, a language, and independence. Indeed, earlier in the 20s and 30s, there were Zionists who argued that spiritual renewal could never lead to the acquisition of territory and should never take the form of the development of a state, right? So there were forms of Zionism that were anti-state and anti-land acquisition. Now, I believe it's impossible to think about Zionism without those two features. In any case, Buber's ethical question emerges in the midst of his political problem with Ben-Gurion, who declared Jewish sovereignty as the legitimating ground for the state of Israel. He reposes questions that he understands Ben-Gurion to have refused to answer. And I quote, "How will people live with each other in this land? What will people say to each other in that language? What will be the connection of their independence with the rest of humanity?" He notes that the advocates for normalization are not interested in such questions. He imagines the riposte of his Zionist opposition in a mocking way: "Be normal, have a state, you've already been reborn." In 1919, Buber became a leading voice in the Jewish renewal movement, one that took its distance from the dominance of Talmudic studies and rabbinic law. He distinguished between religion and religiosity, contrasting the former with the ritualistic observance of law with a living, authentic, and creative practice. He was not alone throughout the 1920s as the Jewish renewal movement grew. Indeed, renewal was associated with re-education, but also with the renewal of the Jewish people as a people. In 1925, he was part of a group called Brit Shalom that was dedicated, and I quote, "to absolute political equality of two culturally autonomous peoples in Palestine." And later, in 1942, he was part of Ihud, a party whose name translates as union, which focused on forms of social and cultural union between Jews and Arabs. Ihud opposed the partition plan, preferring federated models and joint government, and in May of 48, Ben-Gurion's Yishuv vanquished Ihud politically. For Buber, this was the beginning of the end of Zionism as he had known it. Indeed, from 1948 on, Zionism entered into what we could call permanent scare quotes. Okay, so there are many things to say about this. In this short and angry text, Buber offers the following reminder to Ben-Gurion and his followers: "This land is not today devoid of inhabitants, as it was not in those times in which our nation trod upon it as they burst forth out of the desert. But today we will not tread upon it as conquerors. Today we are not obliged to conquer the land, for no danger is in store for our spiritual essence or our way of life from the population of the land." He then goes further: "Today we are permitted to enter into an alliance with the inhabitants in order to develop the land together and make it a pathfinder in the Near East, a covenant of two independent nations with equal rights, each of whom is its own master in its own society and culture, but both united in the enterprise of developing their common homeland and in the federal management of shared matters." Okay. So, because my time is limited, I'm going to move toward the last part of my remarks. Excuse me. In 1999, Saeed maintained the necessity of a constitutional democracy, but also a way of reconciling the right of return for Jews and the law of return for Palestinians. He also wrote, and I quote, that the beginning is to develop something entirely missing from both Israeli and Palestinian realities today: the idea and practice of citizenship, not of ethnic or racial community, as the main vehicle for coexistence. For Saeed, this meant recognizing that Palestinians and Israelis, including Palestinian Israelis, are bound together, irrevocably connected, but also that self-determination has to be exercised in a substantial way. So the political task is precisely to forfeit neither self-determination nor cohabitation. Clearly, Saeed was not just talking about modes of citizenship for Palestinians living within 48, but for all the dispossessed. And this meant a certain exercise of citizenship even prior to its institutionalization. At the same time, he recognized that without political change, including the end to colonizing practices, there could be no substantial citizenship or livable cohabitation. One can work from one end or the other, but the work has to depart from both perspectives. Some of the arguments about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in relationship to projects of coexistence seem to be caught up precisely in arguing about these two ways of proceeding. Either one has to start with radical structural change in order then to cooperate, or one has to locate cooperation in the struggle for structural change. I read Saeed and Buber as asking a common question. How is it that any of us address and receive one another? Neither took the fact of communication for granted, but for communication to happen, there has to be a world in which you can hear, an audible world, whether that is something that your ears let you do or a set of technologies enable for you. There may have to be a translation from one language to another, and so an able translator. And if we cannot seek recourse to receive another's words, then there is no I and no you, and certainly then no possibility for union, for cohabitation, much less binationalism. As you know, on this topic, it's often quite literally impossible to hear what another says. We think, oh, if another has that view, I cannot hear what the other says. The view can be Zionism or anti-Zionism, since there are people on both sides who shut out any discourse that is perceived to belong to the other. Finding a way to speak and a way to hear is essential to any deliberate and reflective consideration of this issue, and yet in speaking about this issue, one runs into a crisis of speakability and audibility all the time. What can be spoken and still heard? What is permitted? What is censored? How is the sphere of audibility restricted so that when I hear certain arguments, I must literally leave the space of that speaking in order to feel okay again, or I must invoke a law to stop that speech? We all have our limits, to be sure, but sometimes a space is opened in which one can come up against those limits on hearing or receiving and abide by that anxiety it produces without immediately reaching for the censor. So part of what I've been doing this morning is simply to note that Zionism as a history has itself undergone several transformations. So when we quickly presume that Zionism seems to be confirmed or refuted on the basis of the question, do you believe Israel has the right to exist? We forget that Zionism has become now associated with the principle of Jewish sovereignty, and that the history of Zionism in its relationship to binationalism has been eviscerated. One important dimension of the history of Zionism is precisely an active set of debates about the grounds that would legitimate such a state. In 1929, Buber wrote an essay entitled Zionism and Nationalism, in which he tried to distinguish the one from the other. And although that essay has its limitations, it does include the following imaginary dialogue with a nationalist. You might object, if we do not participate in the necessary politics of power, how can we secure ourselves? How will we secure this settlement, the beginning Volksland in Palestine? To this I reply, no conceivable security is as real as this is Buber, to become a power in spirit that can sustain the forms of life among the nations, that can become a living example of relations between the nations, that can help prepare a true covenant between Orient and Occident, and from there, on the basis of this work, form an alliance with the future elements of all nations. Of course, there's a difficult balance conveyed by Buber's statement, namely the idea of a living example of relations between the nations. In other words, he's not speaking about an exemplary nation, but a living example of a set of relations, suggesting what is most living and most exemplary is interrelationship. He shifts the emphasis off the nation to its interrelations, and in that sense stands for what we might call the between of nations. Binationalism in this view is not the simple conjoining of one nation with another, but the active and exemplary enactment of the relation that holds among them. In 1929, Buber confessed upon a return from a trip to Palestine, Let us beware of regarding and treating as inferior what is foreign to us and not sufficiently known. Let us be careful not to commit ourselves to what has been committed against us. And let it be said again that while self-assertion is a natural precondition of all our actions, it is not enough. It also requires imagination, the ability to imagine the soul of the other, of the stranger, from within the reality of our own. I must not hold back a confession. It was appalling to me to see in Palestine how little we, the Jewish people, know, the Jewish Ashkenazi people, know of the Arab man. Okay. Yet Buber's notion of imagining the other is not quite the same as dialogue, recapitulating what Saeed has called Orientalism. Whatever local dialogues took place with Palestinian cooperative councils failed to call into question the settler project itself, as I suggested, and Palestinians were regularly regarded as not measuring up to the task of dialogue. We see this continued in the Orientalist discourse that claims that there's no partner on the Palestinian side for a dialogue on peace. And this has been happening now for many decades. This inability to stop and reverse the appropriation of Palestinian lands and the dispossession of its people remains an abiding limit and failure of Buber's analysis. Moreover, his call for a land of two peoples, Jews and Arabs, conceives of them as distinct and homogeneous groups, but 30% of Israeli Jews are from Arab descent. Another 20% of Israelis are non-Jewish Palestinians. How do we understand the opposition between Jew and Arab within this contemporary demographic situation? This means that a good half of Israel is not from European descent, which suggests in turn that the distinction between Arab and Jew rests on a misunderstanding of who is Arab, some Jews are, and who is Jewish, some Arabs are, who is Israeli, some Palestinians are. Secondly, the Palestinians are themselves diverse, made all the more so by virtue of their own scattered condition, nearly 5 million now living in exile from the lands they once owned and where they lived for decades, if not centuries. So it doesn't quite make sense to talk about two peoples as if they were each distinct and internally homogeneous. Finally, we can ask, is the notion of a federated or binational state practical for this time? Well, interestingly, many of those Palestinians who actively argue for a one-state solution are precisely the ones who are committed to living side by side or intermixed with the Jewish population. And yet the one-state solution is clearly feared by those who think either it will produce an Arab demographic majority and dissipate the Jewish character of the state, or, on the other hand, it will produce one greater Israel and destroy Palestinian aspirations for political self-determination. The most basic limit of Buber's analysis is that he wasn't able to grasp the colonial dimensions even of his own version of Zionism. The notion that settlements and settlers have been, from the start, a way of taking over land that was either legally or conventionally the arable land of Palestinians. He didn't understand what a workable binationalism would be, since it would only be possible on the basis of an end to settler colonialism and a workable plan for reparations. I think we see today how the issue of Palestinian statehood is often debated without considering whether an independent state for Palestine will be built within the military and economic structures of occupation, which is one form in which settler colonialism could continue in and through the state apparatus. So before we say, yes, we're for a Palestinian state, ask which state. Since if a Palestinian state incorporates and sustains the occupation, then it becomes a client state at best or an administrative arm of a continuing colonial power. This is, on my part, not an argument against statehood, but it does raise the question, on what grounds statehood? What would make for a democratic and legitimate state, and I ask this not only of Israel, of Palestine, or of any binational federated authority. The question is one that can and must be asked for any proposal of a one-state solution for a federated policy or one based on a notion of shared or dispersed sovereignty. I want to insist it's not a problem to ask this question. It's a necessity. So when we're asked to accept the legitimacy of a state without asking for its reasons, We should wonder what has happened to our discourse such that we no longer have access to the question of what establishes legitimacy to begin with. Indeed, any democratic state has to be able to establish and communicate the conditions of its own legitimacy, showing and demonstrating that legitimacy is precisely an obligation of a state to its people and to all people. Of course, there are always limits to such a demonstration. It's not possible to offer a fully comprehensive and transparent account of the legitimacy of any state. And as we know, historical narratives become intertwined with political arguments precisely at such a juncture, and those hybrid forms of narrative and argument are reproduced and transmitted as legitimating stories. Still, if we retell the history of 1948 such that we see how one group of refugees achieved sanctuary by producing another refugee class, then it seems to me we start to move toward a more complex history. And if we think about the debates about state structure that took place prior to the rejection of the federated model, there seems to be a prehistory to Zionism which might well be useful as its post-history is being imagined. For Buber, the I only knows its world because there is a you who has consciousness of that world. The world is given to me because you are also there as one to whom the world is given. The world is never given to me alone, but always in your company. Without you, the world does not give itself. In effect, I am worldless without you. So who is this you without whom I would be worldless? The particular you, the human one that you are, is only part of the you to whom I am bound and upon whom my sense of world depends. Since in addition to you over there, there are countless numbers of yous, some link between all of you seems to exceed the particular yous that you are. How do we understand that which links all the yous I address and by whom I am addressed? What is this relation? How does it relate to the living and exemplary relation among nations to which Buber referred in the 1920s? Is it a human relation or a divine one? For Buber, it's a divine link to be sure, but the link does not only bind together those who already belong to the same religion or already share the same history, rather it links the I to those who happen to inhabit the same world and those for whom that world is also meant in the sense of equally meant. We could say the world is equally given to all humans, but Buber's point is that where there is no equality among humans, there is no world, a point that is resonant with one made by Hannah Arendt. So if we live under conditions of inequality, we are to that extent worldless. This would mean that the Jewish God for Buber does not appear as a man or as a kind of people, but persists in relations among nations, and that would include the Jewish people and all the non-Jewish peoples of the world. This is one reason why, for him, if Zionism were to signify spiritual renewal or rebirth, it would have to take the political form of a binationalism that would affirm the equality of all people, regardless of their religions, even as it recognizes the cultural specificity of each people. And here I promise this is the end. I know Rosie's getting nervous. For Buber, a Jewish ethic has to be Jewish and non-Jewish to be ethical at all. It implies living in proximity with others on a condition of equality and difference. If I cannot live in the world without you, then my life is bound up with yours, and we lose our world when we lose each other. That condition of reciprocal dependency is the very condition of renewing and repairing the world. Saeed noted in 1999, I see no other way than to begin now to speak about sharing the land that has thrust us together, sharing it in a truly democratic way with equal rights for each citizen. There can be no reconciliation unless both peoples, two communities of suffering, resolve that existence is a secular fact and that it has to be dealt with as such. We can surely question what he means by secular in this instance. It's interesting that Buber arrives, I think, at nearly the same conclusion through spiritual means. All that means is that we need a form of cultural translation between the secular and the religious to make it work. But it's a way, but how do we get there? This idea of two peoples bound together on conditions of equality. Although I did not know him personally, I did not know Saeed personally, I read him regularly, I think it's fair to say that Saeed was often the one to say that the sphere of culture has to be separated from the sphere of politics. He savored the paradoxical and unpredictable character of musical performance. He understood these features of art to be quite different from political debate and negotiation. But politics also is a field in which unpredictable moments emerge, challenging us to sense and feel in new ways. For Saeed, certain forms of dialogue, even possibilities for friendship and musical collaboration, constitute small acts, in Paul Gilroy's terms, that show that one person can offer an unanticipated form of acknowledgement to another, despite the political barriers between them. In Saeed's formulation, you are here, we are here. There's a solicitation to something new. No one is being asked to leave, only to live together in a way that does not refuse that already existing fact of cohabitation on that land. It's also a form of direct address. You are here, we are here, opening up a dialogic form. The formulation doesn't prize dialogue as the substance and aim of politics, but it does mean that those who are forced into exile are also not here or there in a way that needs to be substantially redressed. It accepts the linguistic and political condition of demographic proximity, a border that divides and joins, while rejecting the principle of demographic majority and the historical and contemporary practices of dispossession. On the one hand, a radical structural change is necessary, a constitutional basis for some state, a right of return reconciled with the law of return, the end of settler colonialism, which includes the end of the occupation and continuing land appropriations, the restitution of the rights of Palestinians from their damaged state, for any kind of cohabitation, and for a just form of binationalism to exist. On the other hand, that change can only happen through the smaller acts that build forms of solidarity that keep cooperation from becoming an instrument for ratifying the status quo. Two directions at once. How to know in practice that difference is the difficult task. Thank you.
I'm looking around the room. I'm going to be clustering the questions. There's one in the middle. I will need 2 or 3 questions clustered together, please.
All right, thank you very much. That was good.
Bye. Yes?
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting things that you said. When you speak to Israelis nowadays, one thing that you notice very quickly, I'm an Israeli, by the way, who lives in the Netherlands, is that when they talk about citizenship and their relation to the state, it may as well be 1897. The Zionism still draws on a very antiquated notion of citizenship, where in fact, through the 20th century, there has been an update of citizenship through human rights, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and all those things that you mentioned of relations between communities. How do you think that Israelis should introduce more nuance into their conceptions of citizenship? Does the BDS or movements like that constitute a way of doing that? And how do you see the role of victimhood in the type of diasporic identity that Saeed talked about and that you mentioned? That's my question.
Thank you. That is the first question. I'm looking for more questions. Is there any? I would prefer to cluster them. Is anybody willing? Just behind you, thank you. One of our Palestinian students, you're very welcome.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the very interesting lecture.
Speak into the mics, we can't hear you.
Thank you, Professor Judith. I want to ask if the thought of Martin Buber and other anti-Zionists, which I can see them today as anti-Zionist in the 30s, calling for binational state in Palestine through the 30s, wouldn't be a sense of colonization? This is my question. I'm a Palestinian who lives in Israel, and my PhD dissertation is about the Zionist left in Palestine, about the Hashomer Hatzair. And I have went through lots of literature about Martin Buber and the other. Given the number of Jews in Palestine during the 30s, I would question the thought of binationalism through this period. Today, I think the only solution is the binational state in Palestine, Israel. But I would like to hear more about your thought regarding the 30s. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm closing registration. Judy, would you like to come back and speak from here? Oh. It may be easier.
Thank you. Let's see. I mean, I think maybe I would start with the last part of the first question. And I think one of the great suggestions of Saeed is to acknowledge different histories of suffering. So you asked what about victimization, or the history of victimization, and how, I believe you were saying, how important that is to a contemporary sense of Israeli citizenship and its legitimating function in establishing Israeli citizenship. Well, I think there's a wonderful book by Edith Zertal on Israel's Holocaust and the politics of nation building, which actually does talk a little bit about how the history of the genocide under the Hitler regime has become a legitimating narrative. It's, of course, extremely interesting to note that many of the most fierce debates about the binational model happened between 1944 and 48 and among recent survivors of the camps or recent refugees from Europe. So it wasn't exactly an immediate translation. Ben-Gurion's political success was not an immediate translation, and we also know that the UK and the US closed its doors to immigration for migrating European Jews. So much of that story has to change. The only point I want to emphasize here is that I think what Saeed sensed was that radical displacement and dispossession now characterizes the history of both peoples, and that there's a possibility of a resonance and acknowledgement, even I think a way of connecting the people or forming alliances on that basis, which is not to say that they were the same histories. They're not the same histories at all. And nevertheless, they do raise, I think, very basic questions about the rights of refugees, which is why he said that it was most important to think about reconciling the law of return, which allows rabbinically identifiable Jews to return to Israel whenever they wish, and the right of return for Palestinians who are dispossessed of their homes. What would it mean to have a comprehensive and internally consistent refugee doctrine? And that seems to me to be one of the most important challenges for international law, and one that would actually come out of an understanding of shared histories of displacement. It makes the right of return less frightening, right, as a demand. If we were to say a comprehensive and internally consistent international understanding of the rights of refugees in the region, right? No one would say, oh, that's really the destruction of everything we've ever known about modern civilization. Okay. I think that that's important, and it may also relate to what we're talking about when we're talking about citizenship, which is not just the rights of citizenship that are already part of a given state's definition of what a citizen might be, but a broader sense of citizenship that we are struggling for. Okay, so that's my answer to the first. And to the second one, I think we have to acknowledge that Buber's idea of federated authority was implicated in colonizing practices and colonizing conceptions of and Orientalist ideas about two peoples, okay? So we kind of go back to that. What I wonder about is whether some of those aspirations can, along with a radical critique of its colonizing past, be transposed or translated into a contemporary politics that would have as its aim the establishment of a binational state through the end to settler colonialism. What can be taken, what can be adapted, what must be left behind, and what new form does that take? So I think that that's important. I think it is there as a kind of impure resource, and I suppose that's the most that I can say about it.